It's PowerPoint. It's disgusting. No taste. I don't know why I got so loud on this one, but I did. Perhaps because I made it a couple years ago when it was kind of in a different, sort of a different era for me. This was my loud phase, my artistic career. Modern thought, progress to uncertainty. Um, You've maybe seen the famous picture here, The Scream by Edvard Munch in 1893. A remarkable painting in many ways. It actually was stolen a number of years ago. I won't get into that. But it's quite, I think, indicative of the time period, to be sure. And though a brilliant painting in many ways, it's not one that I'd want hanging in my house. For obvious reasons, I guess. I like, I love artwork, and I like different types of art. But when I come home, I want to have artwork on the wall that doesn't cause me to freak out and have an anxiety attack. For something that's calming and soothing, and has sort of more traditional beauty to it. Nonetheless, this painting fits a modern thought in some ways to a T. We're only going to talk about one painter, and it won't be Munch after this. But this is one of the great paintings of the modernist period. The acceleration of collective learning in a deeply complex world. Collective learning, if I haven't used the term before, is just a fancy way of saying that human beings know anything about the world at all by information that comes about collectively. We don't learn anything on our own except for just things we might experience by going into the woods and playing around as a kid or whatever. But nothing you learn is totally by yourself. I'm not saying you shouldn't take credit for and feel proud of good grades you get in a class like this one or whatever. Of course you should. But you didn't do it all by yourself, and I don't even mean just me. The textbook and Canvas and any Googling that you do and whatever it may be. There's more than one person, you, involved in the learning process. And of course, with modern technology, and by the late 19th, early 20th century, it was getting increasingly sophisticated, but nothing like today. But the more sophisticated technology gets, move up, fast forward to today, we're talking about computers and social media, smartphones, etc. Now we're really living in a complex, deeply interconnected world. Everybody's sort of wired, networked together, in some ways almost literally. And so things get much more complicated when you get into this kind of world. And we get to the other side of the Industrial Revolution by the 1890s. I mean, the Industrial Revolution is underway and in full swing really in all of the European countries. And things start to look strange to many people and frightening to many people as well. Things are getting complex in ways that not everyone is comfortable with. European thought in an age of science, modernization, and progress. So one of the things that we're going to do here, I forget if I have a slide on this. I have a slide at all. I don't have a slide on that, sorry. But my key got stuck there. What's wrong? I must have spilled coffee on it or something. But European thought in an age of science, modernization, progress. So what this unit is going to attempt to do is to try to show us that something about the European mindset, worldview changed rather significantly around the time of the late 19th, certainly into the 20th century, in the first decades, in the way Europeans thought. And we'll do this not by examining popular culture, though we could do that too, but we'll do it by examining some of the most famous works by novelists and painters, scientists, etc., etc., which is kind of what we've been doing with regard to intellectual history all the way through. And I'm splitting this sort of into this unit into two parts. In the first part, we're going to look at thinkers who really were from the first half of the 19th century, or kind of their focal point is around mid-century, about 1815. I'm not saying everybody fits, into, perfectly into that, but for the most part, a group of thinkers who are reflective of the fact that around mid-century, right around the time of the Great Exhibition in London, at the height of Britain's and Europe's kind of confidence in science and technology and enlightenment values and ideas, we'll see some of the thinkers that are sort of the best examples of that type of confidence in reason and progress and science. But something happened, and by the late 19th century, and then the second part of the lecture will deal with how things changed in terms of the thinking of writers, scientists, philosophers, poets, etc., novelists, and what they changed to. And it's fairly simple. The change was from great confidence in Enlightenment values, progress, reason, science, scientific method, to a growing pessimism about it, a growing disillusionment with it, a growing sense that something's not quite right with Enlightenment values. They don't totally hold up. They don't explain enough. The world is much more disordered, much more, legitimately anxiety-producing than the sort of simplistic formulas and sayings, mottos of the Enlightenment would indicate. So Enlightenment values sort of went through a crisis period when a growing number of Europeans came to doubt them. So what could have caused this? Well, there's one culprit that stands out, and there's no doubt that this was a complementary cause, and that's the Great War. The reason it's only a complementary cause is because we're going to see, when we get to the second part, we'll look at thinkers reflective of the change to a more pessimistic outlook from the height of confidence at mid-century. We're going to see that this was happening before the First World War. So it can't be just the First World War. Certainly the Great War, I think, piled on to the already existing pessimism and angst and ennui that was there, but it didn't start it. So I'm not saying there's only one answer to this question, but we're going to keep it simple by only picking out one. I think it is the most likely culprit here, and that is something we've already mentioned, the Industrial Revolution. If you already were thinking that, then you're on the right track already. The Industrial Revolution was a wrenching change. We know there are some groups that weren't wild about it. The traditional conservatives weren't wild about it. The English Romantic poets, some of whom were traditional conservatives themselves, weren't wild about it. So there are some that didn't like it, period. But even positive changes that came about through the Industrial Revolution sometimes were still very stressful, anxiety producing, which happens even now. I always use this example, I don't know why, but hypothetically, if you were to apply to Harvard University after a community college and you got in, would you be excited? Hell yeah, you would. I mean, who wouldn't be? But would you also be nervous and scared? Admit it, you'd be scared. I would. I'd be scared now. I've been a professor for 23 whatever years, plus years, and I'd be scared now if I got into Harvard. I mean, not as an undergrad, but if I got into graduate school, I'd be scared. I'd go. I'd be, I think, ultimately confident that I'd make it, but I'd have some initial worries. Wow, there's going to be some pretty damned heavy competition there. So sometimes even the positive events in our lives can cause stress and all kinds of issues. So both positive and negative features of the modern industrializing world, I think, we're prone to opening up questions about Enlightenment values and attitudes. So We'll deal with a number of thinkers first that are reflective of the confidence that was still around, and maybe confidence kind of reaching an apex, based on Enlightenment values and ideals. And then we'll start getting into the more gloomier, darker, depressive thinking of late 19th, early 20th century Europe. And we'll also come into contact with modern science as well, which doesn't fit our categorization here of going from confidence in the Enlightenment to suspicion of the Enlightenment, but it fits a little bit. So we'll look at the two revolutions in modern science that come, actually three in a sense, that come during this period, but two that come kind of in the more anxiety-prone latter stage of our chronology here. We're going to deal with more thinkers that are reflective of the more pessimistic outlook, and fewer that reflect the more traditionally consistent optimistic outlook. And we'll start with the latter. Auguste Comte, not very well known today, but usually considered one of the fathers of sociology. There are some others on our list that also are considered founders or fathers of sociology as well. A French thinker. His sort of intellectual prime was right around the mid-century, so he fits the chronology pretty well. A French engineer with a thorough scientific education, and was extremely high on what science could do to improve the world, to improve society. So in that, he's thoroughly Enlightenment oriented. He said, the quote from underneath his picture here in the lower left, "I shall bring factual proof that there are just as definite laws for the development of the human race as there are for the fall of a stone." That's pretty confident in what evidence and data and scientific method, inductive reasoning can actually do. That's really a reference to Newton, right? I can give you equations that are sort of as airtight in telling you what the laws of human development are as Newton did for gravity and the laws of motion. That's borderline boastful or delusional, one could even argue. He called for a completely scientific approach to history and modern society, sure knowledge from observed facts. He divided history into three broad, long-term metaphysical stages, historical stages. Historical stages. One of them is the metaphysical stage. That's the middle one. On either side, the theological and scientific or positivistic phase. And by this he means that in the theological age, going back farther in history, human beings tended to make decisions primarily based on religion and religious thinking. And then it switched to metaphysical when people started for hundreds of years, last time, but started to make decisions based on rational thought, but not rational thought on top of evidence and data and experiments, just metaphysical thought, which is sort of trying to do purely speculative reasoning to figure out how the world works, which he thought was a step up from the theological, but was inferior to the more modern scientific way of thinking, which certainly employs reason, like philosophers, metaphysicians had done for centuries before, but it employs reason only when attached to evidence and facts, right, and things that are demonstrable in the real world. And so this is classic Enlightenment stuff. He's a neo-Enlightenment figure in many ways, but not necessarily a normal one. And there were some Enlightenment figures who I tended not to focus on, with the exception of Rousseau, who got pretty out there with their Enlightenment views. But this guy got out there. He actually wrote on the need for a new religion of humanity, which he to some degree designed. with a scientific industrial elite to replace a real priesthood. So instead of real pastors or Catholic priests, you'd have technocrats who are now kind of the elites that you bow down to. So there's something terrifying about this. Lastly, what he's really putting forward is a technocratic utopia, and it has real overtones, as it says, of totalitarianism in here, because if you read his work, and it's not really fun to read, and it is a bit eerie. I don't think he meant it that way, but it's how it comes across. That if we listen to science and we listen to the experts, they'll tell us what we should do for a living. They'll place us where they need us to be, so that everyone can be placed in where it fits them best, and everyone can be placed in a way that benefits society the most. And so there's a real reliance on knowledge crunched from the numbers, achieved in the lab, or through experimentation, and the conclusions just understand that it's for the best. It's for the good of humanity. So it's not only totalitarian. There's a certain, I think, socialist way of thinking in here, which is partly utopian, but partly this idea that if you don't really like this, just recognize that it's for the good of humanity. It's for the good of the whole. It's the collective that really matters here. Not so much you, but you're going to be better off anyway. So Comte, in his book, A General View of Positivism, that's the philosophy, the name of the philosophy, which became a philosophic school. I don't mean literally, but a school of thought. And he's the father of it. He had acolytes as well. But I do think there's something frightening about this. And in my view, and I could be wrong, but just to my taste, as much as I am enamored of science and scientific thought and what science can and has done, and I truly am, I do think that it sometimes crosses the line and becomes too overconfident. And I'll use the phrase again. I used it before. The term for this today, when nothing but scientific type of knowledge, meaning acquired the way that Comte believed it had to be acquired to be legitimate, scientism, when you're basically dogmatic about science without realizing, wait a minute, science isn't supposed to be dogmatic. That's religion. When science starts to become dogmatic and sort of says, look, this is the only way to believe, this is right, and you're wrong, and there's no two ways about it, then I think it goes too far. But nonetheless, going too far with confidence in scientific reasoning is perfect for us here, because it shows us that Comte fits perfectly into this age where confidence in Enlightenment values was so high that it was apt to become overconfidence. Next we get to John Stuart Mill, though you can't entirely see him. Sorry. John Stuart Mill, one of my favorite intellectuals of all time, a liberal, at least in name. His most famous piece of writing, you can kind of see here, On Liberty, 1859, an essay that still gets read even today. But Mill was a remarkable mind, individual, a polymath. He could write about, and did write about, virtually anything. He never went to college. He just skipped it. His father James Mill was a philosopher before him. His father's best friend was Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill's often considered a utilitarian as well. He did write a book or essay called Utilitarianism as well. But his thought was, I think, more expansive and more varied than his father's or Bentham's, but he was surely influenced by both of them. He was raised almost in a petri dish. His father and Bentham believed that emotions just got in the way of human beings' rational development, and so they homeschooled him. And he didn't have any like emotional outlets, no play, no finger painting. He just did his lessons, all day long, day after day after day. And he was gifted. So the giftedness plus having two great, at least two brilliant teachers who force you to do advanced work all the time, put this guy on a course to become the prodigy of all prodigies. And he was doing advanced math at like 8 and speaking Greek at 6, and so incredible. And so at 16, like he could have easily gone to Oxford or Cambridge, but I don't even need it. I'm sure his father agreed, and he just started his writing career, started getting publishing, essays published and this and that. He eventually wrote a book on economics that became the standard overview in Great Britain and for a time all of Europe. And he didn't have any degrees in economics. He didn't have degrees in anything. So the guy could, a polymath who could really think, deeply, and was quite knowledgeable on many, many subjects. But by the way, that lab experiment that his father did on him, it appears cost him, though we don't know for sure, but at about, 19, young adulthood, somewhere in there, he had a nervous breakdown. And was it because his father tried to, force him to study all the time and give him no emotional outlets, no time for fun? We don't know, but most likely. He thought so, because in his much later autobiography, Mill Jr. here, wrote that one of the ways he got himself out of his funk, into this sort of Great Depression, and one of the ways he got out of it, he claims anyway, was reading, yes, you guessed it, the English Romantic poets, right? Because these guys were gushing with emotion and imagination in their work. It's one of the hallmarks of Romantic writing. So it is quite believable. I don't know why he would lie about it. No, he could have. It does make it sound like it probably was. He needed some sort of emotional outlet that he didn't have at home, in his life at all. So he was a struggling young adult trying to figure it out. What do I do? There wasn't, medication for these kind of problems in those days. There wasn't, psychology and psychiatry wasn't really around yet. At least not, therapeutic. So he did what he connected to what he thought he needed. Maybe he wasn't even conscious at the time. He just sort of gravitated to it and realized this makes me feel better. So that alone is a fascinating story. And says something about his father that's not necessarily good. In his brilliant career, he wrote books on many things. He was a liberal, but a non-ideological liberal, an open-minded liberal, who, and this is one of the reasons I like him, is because he wasn't dogmatic. He wasn't particularly ideological. There are some historians that disagree with this point and think of him as quite less open-minded than he made himself out to be. I don't really agree with them, but it is sort of out there as a point of contention. But to me, he took other people's ideas seriously, other ideologies seriously. I haven't been drinking much. Took them seriously without embracing any of them. So he claimed he was a liberal, but a mild liberal, but he flirted with conservative ideas, socialist ideas, and was seems to be more interested in like what works. I don't have to sort of take an entire ideology and wear it 100% of the time. What if one ideology works and has a good idea for this, and another one has a good idea for that? And so he's sort of trying on ideologies, like he's sort of at a smorgasbord or a buffet, right? You don't go to a buffet and say, you know what, all you guys that are with me here, the only way to eat a buffet, the only acceptable way for me or for you, is to just eat mashed potatoes. And if you go back for seconds, just mashed potatoes, nothing else. You do it at a buffet. never been there before anyway, right? Just put some stuff on the plate that looks good, things that you like. You hope their version of it is good. Some things you've never tried before, maybe. And it's kind of like you do an experiment. You go sit down and eat, and you go back for seconds. Well, I liked this. I'm going to have more of that. This wasn't so good. Their version of it, their, I don't know, chicken a la king. I like it, but not theirs isn't very good. I'm not going to have any of that. And so you kind of change, and you're open about what you are eating as you go along. So you're flexible, and intellectually, I think Mill was flexible. He hung out for a time with the who were older by this time, conservative poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge. We talked about romantic poets, and his liberal friends chided him for it. And he said, "No, you guys don't understand. These guys have a lot to teach, and well, they're brilliant individuals, and some of their ideas are important. I don't agree with all of them, everything they say, but I can surely learn something from them." And he did, and he had some socialist ideas as well. His economic thought combined capitalism with some socialist ideas. For instance, he believed in, or I shouldn't say believe in, he was very interested in worker-owned businesses, which is surely a socialist idea. Now, he believed it would be interesting to have some worker-owned businesses within an overall capitalist system, so that some business would be traditionally capitalist, having an owner or a corporation, board of trustees and board of directors and shareholders, but competing with them would be worker-owned businesses. So they'd have to still compete in a capitalist marketplace, but some of the businesses would be worker-owned, which is a socialist idea. So that's a good example of him having ideas of mixing capitalism with at least certain socialist ideas. He was progressive politically. He believed in representative government with some limits. He wasn't an outright Democrat. He was radical completely in another way. He believed in complete equality for women. Complete. 100%. And he was so well known for it that the leader of the women's rights movement in Great Britain, a woman, of course, at one point called Mill the founder of the women's rights movement. And he rather wisely declined the accolade and said, "No, I'm not the founder." But she insisted that he was. I'm not arguing that he was or wasn't. Just that he seems to have been a sincere, advocate of complete equality for women. Otherwise, I don't think he would have gotten that compliment from somebody, that high up in the movement itself. He did believe in limits on government power and authority. This is where his sort of, overall, mild liberalism, I think, comes from. I believe that government must intervene. However, to promote self-development, he supported mandatory public schools long before they were ever a thing. So another way in which his views were progressive, ahead of their time, in certain senses. So Mill, though mid-century guy, basically shows the typical confidence of in the Enlightenment tradition, reason, right, scientific method, sort of measured, progress-oriented reforms and policies, economic and otherwise, designed for kind of maximum rational results. Utilitarianism was as a heavily rational philosophy to a fault. And again, he was a more mild, I think, utilitarian than his father or Jeremy Bentham, but he did have that in his background, to be sure. In On Liberty, he makes his case, among other things, for complete freedom of speech. And I like him for this reason as well. On Liberty is sometimes, I think, misunderstood today. Libertarians, for instance, tend to love it. And Americans who come from that perspective tend to think that Mill is saying that freedom just means the freedom to do whatever the hell you want, whenever you want to. And that's partially true in terms of Mill's views. but his views are much more nuanced than that. Mill said more or less, it wouldn't be a free society if it wasn't true that you can do whatever the hell you want, assuming you're not hurting someone else in the process. So yeah, if you want to do, totally irresponsible and immature and idiotic and trivial things your whole life because you have the freedom to do so and you're not hurting anybody else, then we can't stop you, or it isn't a free society. However, you shouldn't do that with your freedom. The real point of having freedom is to give you the access, give you the wherewithal, give you the room to do creative things, to do productive things with your life, at least some of the time, if not all of the time. So yeah, it's not a free society if you can't do whatever you want, whenever you want to, with your freedom, but it's really not what you should be doing with it. So you attach really kind of a real ethical element to this. He's famous for saying, if all mankind minus one were of one opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. So he said, if one person in the whole world holds an idea and everybody else in the whole world is against him, the rest of mankind has no right to suppress that guy's viewpoint. None. And I think what is sometimes seen as an extreme, and I just called it that myself a minute ago, a view on freedom of speech is actually just the definition of freedom of speech. It has to be extreme, or it's not freedom of speech. He says, quoting him, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he's equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. Nor is it enough that he should hear the opinions of adversaries from his own teachers, presented as they state them, and accompanied by what they offer as refutations. He must be able to hear them from persons who actually believe them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form." And yet, another reason that I'm greatly enamored of and influenced by John Stuart Mill, what he's saying here, I've said in class before, not quite so eloquently, admittedly, but Mill is saying here, if you really want to understand the world and have an opinion that actually matters, you have to study from many different points of view. You can't just listen to, sort of what the opposition, opposed to your viewpoint, is saying from your teacher, who also believes in the same, from the same point of view that you do, because they're likely to build a straw man argument against the other side. You have to go and dig for yourself and find, get it from the horse's mouth and find out exactly what the other side is saying and take them seriously. And then, if you are seriously using reason and evidence and logic, then you can refute them if you're still convinced, as being as open-minded and as objective as is humanly possible, that they're still wrong. Otherwise, you have no business claiming or strongly believe that your side is correct. So, lastly, on Mill, back to his views on freedom of speech. This is a particular pet issue of mine, as you probably already know from earlier in the class, but freedom of speech is, I think, widely misunderstood. We don't need, like in this country today, in the U.S. Today, we don't need freedom of speech rights protected by the Constitution under the First Amendment to say things that everyone's going to agree with. Why would we need? Why would we need any constitutional backing for me to say, water is wet, the sky is blue, grass is green? I don't need the First Amendment protection for that, because no one's going to possibly get ruffled by it. The very point of having legal and constitutional protections for free speech is on the chance that I might say and believe something that other people don't like, that other people find, yes, offensive. That's exactly the point of protections for freedom of speech. is in case somebody uses their freedom of speech to say something that someone else doesn't like so much that they take offense to it. That is the point of freedom of speech. I think our society, by and large, is becoming increasingly confused on this subject. But Mill, in my view, saw it extremely clearly.